All right, question number 1 says this. I'm just going to read this here. Do you know how we love to quote the scripture that says Jesus was tempted in all points such as we are, yet without sin? It's a really comforting passage when we're going through temptation. We have a high priest who can identify with us. So got a question from a Christian, and he says to me that Jesus was tempted with homosexuality. My immediate response was, and I'm just going to paraphrase this, kind of taken back, went through the points, thought about it, didn't know how to answer it. And so it goes like this. Obviously, we know Jesus never committed sin, but we definitely know that he was tempted. How far down the rabbit trail does that go? And when you're looking at specifically sexual sin, how does that work with the temptation of Christ relating to us? Pastor Steve.
Right. So the passage itself is in verse 15 of Hebrews chapter 4. It says, we do not have a high priest points tempted as we are, yet without sin. And then it says, let us therefore come boldly to the throne of grace that we may obtain mercy and find grace to help in time of need. And so again, Hebrews 4:15 and 16. Okay, so how are you tempted without sin? One of the things that we have when we're talking about Jesus is a situation where he's God in human flesh. And so the fullness of God, of the Godhead, was found in bodily form in Jesus. And so Jesus had desires that went along with the Father. He was never out of fellowship with the Father ever. Okay? And so when you're thinking about temptation, temptation is something that comes at you from outside, or it comes at you from inside. Okay, so with us, we have a sin nature. And so in James chapter 1, it says that what happens with us is we are tempted and taken away by our own desires. And when desire has conceived, then it brings forth death. The difference between us and Jesus is that he didn't, again, have a sin nature. He was an unfallen man. And so there's still temptations, and those temptations come from the outside. Specifically, Jesus was tempted by the devil, for example. And so you see how Jesus handles the temptation of the devil. The devil comes up with something, and Jesus comes up with scripture and says, get away from me, basically. And so it's pretty straightforward. And it's a great way to handle temptation in our own lives. But again, there's a qualitative difference between the two. So what we will do with that is we will look at that and we'll go, okay, well, if he's not attracted to the temptation, then how is he tempted just like I am?
I was just going to ask that.
Yeah. And again, you have to look at the word temptation itself. It's the idea of a test. He's tested. And when you're looking at a test, you can test somebody knowing that they're going to fail and tempt them in that kind of way, or you can test somebody to prove that they're not going to fail.
Right.
And so the first time I ever heard this explained to me was with locomotives on a bridge, on a railroad bridge. And so there have been times when train companies have taken locomotives and they piled them on a train bridge. Obviously, the heftiest part of a train, the most massive part of a train, put them a bunch of them on a train bridge, and they're not doing it to see if the bridge is going to collapse. They're doing it to prove that it won't. And so when you're talking about the temptation of Christ, the temptations come up against Jesus, not to see if he's going to collapse, but to prove that he's not. And so he is able to endure temptation. And when we look at that, we go, okay, well, that's not fair because it's not exactly the same as what we're going through. No, in actuality, it's worse. And so when I think about the temptation of Christ, I've got animals, and so I love to use this illustration. Pigs. I like pigs. I think pigs are hilarious, and pigs are actually pretty smart, and they're not as filthy a lot of times as people think they are. It's like they've got a place where they go number 2. But number one, they do not care. They do not care. And so one of the things you have to do with pigs is you have to have a place for them to wallow because they don't sweat. And so you have never sweated like a pig unless you don't sweat at all. And so they have to wallow in mud or water to cool themselves down. And in the place where they wallow, they don't care if they pee in it. And so in a lot of ways, in some ways pigs are really clean, in other ways pigs are really filthy, okay? And so whenever I think about the incarnation of Jesus, I think of it along those terms. What if God came to me and said, I want to reach the pigs? And he said to me, Steve, I want to use you to reach the pigs. And I go, okay, well, you're going to teach me piggy? Am I gonna learn pig language? And he goes, no, you need to become a pig. Well, right there, I've got a problem. Yeah, I don't want to be a pig. I'm a human. I am a higher life form than a pig, and I don't want to do piggy things. And pigs eat things that they relish things that are just gross. In the sense of, you take up all the old vegetables, anything, it doesn't matter what they look like, and the sloppier it is, the more they like it. So you take it out and put it in their feed bowl, and they're just so excited about the whole thing. And can you imagine being a human in pig form and somebody brings out a bunch of slop to you? And it's just like, it's a presentation of things that pigs just love, and I would be looking at it and going, oh my goodness, I have to eat this. And all the things that pigs do with each other and all the things that they go through, it would just be disgusting. It would be disgusting. And so when you think of Jesus coming to the earth, the temptation of Christ doesn't have to be something where he really, really wants to lust, for example, or to have sexual relations with a woman, or in this case, with another man. It's just it's the fact that Satan has Jesus in a place where he's got a body, and his body is subject to temptation. He's in a place where he's with a group of people, and the lifestyle of the people is one, like literally, you guys, gross thing after another gross thing after another gross thing, and we all think it's normal. And we've got the uncreated, completely holy, never been tempted by sin in those kinds of arenas, hasn't been presented to God ever in that kind of situation. And Jesus has to endure that for his whole life. The guy went through the birth canal. The guy was a baby, had dirty diapers, all of the stuff that we go through. Just disgusting when you're talking about God coming in human form. And so that's what I'm talking about when I'm saying Jesus coming down as God in humanity. That's worse than anything that we could ever go through. And so Jesus being tempted, it's it's like Satan, I don't know, the piggy Satan coming up to the Jesus piggy and saying, hey, would you like some of this wallow mud mixed with pee? Would you like to drink that? And Jesus going, no. And it's not something that he's like, oh, no, I would
trying really hard on that.
Trying really hard not to want that, but yeah, no.
Yeah.
Okay,
so you quoted James. I was going to read this verse, and it changes the way I read it now that you just explained that. It says, where do wars and fights come from among you? Do they not come from your desires for pleasure that war in your members? And when you go pig slop, it changes that passage.
Right.
Because that desire for pleasure that war in your members is now explained in the context of what Jesus would have been going through, and it changes the context.
Right. And so when you're looking at what Jesus lived, he came to do God's will, and he delighted in it. And so this is Jesus, his whole life. delighting in God's will, and interrupted by all of these presentations of, his brothers going, well, if you're really the Messiah, why don't you just go and announce it? Mm. And that's a presentation to be prideful. Yeah. And obviously Jesus doesn't go for that. And thinking that he was like, oh, you know what? I really do want to do that because, I want people focused on me and how awesome I am and that kind of thing. And God could do that because it's right that you would glorify God, but the fleshly nature, it's like that whole pride thing, it's not something that existed with Christ. Because again, he's an unfallen man. He's the second Adam. And so you have a different situation going on. If you had the unfallen Adam coming even, he would be disgusted by the life that we have. And again, Adam is so much lower than Christ himself because Adam was a created being. And when you're talking about a man becoming a pig, it would be more along the lines of a man becoming a maggot and having to live a maggot life. But even that doesn't compare because a man is a created being and a maggot is a created being. And what you have is the uncreated coming into the natural realm and coming as an actual human. And so again, you see that. Even there are passages. There's one major passage that deals with the difference between Christ and the Father as far as their will goes, and it's when Jesus was tempted in the garden, and he said, "Father, if there's any way, let this cup pass from me." He prays that 3 different times, and the answer was no. And Jesus submitted to the Father, and it says that he sweat great drops of blood, and I don't think he was sweating it because he was worried necessarily about the pain that was going to take place on the cross. And this speaks to the points that I was making before. I think that the reason that Jesus was so upset about the atonement is because he was going to be separated from the Father for the first time, and he was going to have the sin of the world put on him. It's darkness that he had never experienced before. And so you see Jesus with his human will saying, Father, if there's any other way. And yet he submitted to the will of the Father.
I was just thinking about that before you mentioned it, and it was in the context of Peter, where he basically tried to stop him from going to the cross, and he says, "Get behind me, Satan."
Exactly.
And he attributes it to, and I'm not saying that was the case, but this almost satanic temptation for him not to do it.
Right. And
this reaction as such that you wouldn't understand if you didn't know what was going on there.
Right, exactly. And I do think it's satanic. I think that when Jesus said that to Peter, Peter was being inspired by the enemy at that point.
Right.
To not go to, to get Jesus to not go to the cross.
Yeah.
And, so Jesus reacted appropriately.
Yep.
In that passage. So.